So we are going to go ahead and get started officially. For anyone who's new here, my name is Mira. I help oversee demand gen here at Phil. We're so excited to have you today to have a great presentation on metrics you can be using to improve patient and brand outcomes. We have Tim Jones from Syneos joining us today, as well as our very own Sahil. We would love this conversation to be interactive today. So if you have questions at any point, we would love to be answering them throughout. Please just put them in the Q&A box located at the bottom of your screen there, and I'll be monitoring, and we will also save time at the end. Sahil, without further ado, I will pass it over to you to kick us off.
Great. Thanks, Mira. So we won't spend too much time talking through about what we're going to talk about, but I think it'll be a good conversation as we dive in. Our goal is to make sure that we're not just talking in generalities, but really getting to specifics. So we'll kind of dive in as we keep going down, double clicking into more and more detail and examples to hopefully make sure this is actionable and helpful for everyone. Maybe to kind of kick off a little bit as we go in here. Introducing myself. So Sahil Naik, General Manager here at Phil. I lead our customer success team, so working with our clients day in and day out about commercialization strategy, business rules, how we optimize the program, help more patients start therapy. And so, spend a lot of time on these topics pretty much every single day here at Phil. And so then we'll turn it over to Tim to introduce himself as well.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Sahil. Tim Jones. I'm Vice President of Commercial Excellence at Syneos. So if you in deployment solutions, all of the sort of data operational services report into our group. So every day we're talking about how we can use strategy, analytics, CRM, IC in different ways to drive performance for our customers. And I'm very excited to talk about this subject today.
Great. Then, as we get started, we'd love to maybe kick off with a poll. And Mira, I think you'll kick this off, correct?
Yep, it has launched, and we'd love to hear everyone's answers. Just give everyone another minute or two to share their thoughts in the poll here, and then we'll go ahead and read it out. All right, I'm going to close the poll now and share the results.
Interesting. So yeah, pretty concentrated here in terms of the results on most folks saying sufficient data, but sometimes lacking insights, and then almost half of folks saying that there's not a lot of structure and insights.
I think it's almost they read the what we're going to talk about today, because there's so much of that going on today. The investments around data and technology continue to skyrocket, and it's finding ways to actually utilize that in order to drive those decisions and drive performance. So I think you're definitely in the right place today.
Great. So, maybe if we then kind of start at a high level, and we'll continue to tailor the conversation to what we've heard from the poll from you guys in terms of really taking the data and what we can do with it. But if we kind of take a step back to start, as we look at the pharma industry, there is a big gap. And I think most folks already know this, right? About in terms of both data availability and information asymmetry in the space. There's a lot of stakeholders that are involved in patient care to get the therapy in the hands of a patient, and using a ton of different systems, using a ton of different ways to navigate care, and making all of those talk to each other is really hard. And so, we see it especially from the pharma manufacturer side that, the information available is not what's typical of, say, other industries. Like if you think about an e-commerce experience where, you track every click, everything that's happening from the moment the patient is even thinking about your product through, what happens afterwards. And, it can be a bit more of a black box in this space. So a lot of what we hope to kind of maybe talk about is how do we help unpack that black box to say, where is more information and how can you use it to better inform, strategy and commercialization strategy.
Yeah. think over the last couple of years, we've seen this trend through various articles and reports. I remember last year seeing a TGAS report saying that only a handful of companies, like it was like 45%, actually had omni-channel at that point, but everybody else was planning on getting it. And almost as if that it just our luck here. Last week, M posted a new survey that shows us what's actually happening today. So it seems like a lot of people who said 2 years ago they were going to get omni-channel have it. A lot of data, a lot of technology. But in that survey, only 39% of the companies surveyed said that it's actually deep enough to drive that success, that they were actually utilizing that data and technology in the right type of way. And what's interesting about it, it's not the lack of data or the technology that was the issue that they were reporting. It was more about the business processes, the culture that was getting in the way of actually utilizing that within their own company. So I think that that's kind of a theme that we'll talk about today, but it's super important and maybe surprising some people and why they might not be getting everything out of the data they have.
Yeah, and I think the other thing to kind of add on there is that that survey kind of indicates that the folks we've got on the webinar here today are average, right? Like everybody is struggling with this. It's a pretty universal that there's data available, but we aren't able to leverage it to the best outcomes we can yet.
Yep. Even the largest pharma companies that we work with every day, they're having the exact same struggles as the smallest new startup companies.
Yeah, and so maybe we can talk about then what a little bit of those struggles look like, right? So how does this actually translate? And there is some data, but you can't use it. What does that actually mean? So I think there's a number of these, gaps in terms of the data sources and structure that we folks have kind of heard about, and then really saying, how do you pull all of this together to make data-driven decisions?
Yeah. So kind of walking through, for anybody who's ever worked with me before, you'll hear like this sort of tiered discussion. It's systems, processes, culture, right? And that's a symbiotic relationship between those two things. At a cultural level, do you understand what your strategy is? Do you understand what good looks like in the performance? And then how next level down from a process perspective, what are those key KPIs that are actually going to deliver that? And what's important is it can't just be one group, an operational group, or it has to be marketing, it has to be sales. Everybody has to be aligned on that. So you have that common language. And then you have the data and the technology to actually be able to deliver that. So often I get asked, like, what can you come in and help me fix my data problems? But in reality, we go in there and there isn't any data problems at all. It's the process, it's the language that's missing. And when you fix those things, then a lot of times you're going to fix that, what we thought was a data problem. But on the flip side, if you're really looking at how to convince those people in your organization that need to open up their wallets for that new data set that you need, having a tight process and culture is going to help you write that business case, show that you're using the data that you have already in the best possible way, and that's going to justify why you should add on and fill in some of those gaps or have that technology that creates that bridge between the silos that you might have. So really looking at an assessment of all three of those levels is really key.
Yeah, Tim, and I think to your point, it really has to be all of them to get the value you want out of the data and the channel. If you're missing one, that creates so many more roadblocks than, having all these pieces working together seamlessly, because you're not going to be able to deliver your outcomes that you're hoping to get without all functions, all kind of data sources giving you the best possible answer out of it.
Yeah. I mean, so often we talk to somebody high level within, let's say they own the entire TA space within a company, and they have a vision, they have what they know is going to be successful. But then you work with the day-to-day stakeholder and they're saying something different. So just because we might have that vision, that language, do we make sure that everybody has it? So those people who are making decisions on your behalf every day are pulling the levers you would expect them to, and using the data that you would expect them to, and making the decisions that work. These things are super important, and not just from a data perspective, but how you run day-to-day operations or any other piece of it. But connecting those groups is super important with that language.
Yeah, and as you kind of talk about that, we talk about a little bit about the outcome side of that, of what comes out of all of this. Right. And so unfortunately, without the ability to utilize this data, as you've mentioned, Tim, a lot of parts of the channel strategy can suffer, and you're not going to be able to make the best decisions that you would otherwise on everything from the patients and how they're able to engage with your product, how they're doing, their adherence, providers, and their awareness of the product, their adoption of the product, what struggles they're facing in terms of working through some of the barriers that can be there for care, especially on, say, more expensive therapies, and brand performance as well. So understanding covered dispenses, sales regions. There's so much that without so many pieces of the puzzle coming together, you're going to get to negative outcomes. And I think this is kind of understood by by the group. And so maybe a question for you, Tim, is what are some of the biggest risks you see that when this visibility is maybe not in as much of a good place as you'd like, how does it show up in maybe some of the clients you work with?
Yeah, I mean, in a lot of different ways, and actually surprising ways, such as the common ones really are you waste capacity. You can't maximize your workforce. You're losing time. Like we are all in a timeline when we're launching a new product. And so every single week that goes by that you don't have the data to make that decision, that's time that you're not going to get back. And then it just increases costs. You're spending money that you don't necessarily need to spend. And what really that you start seeing is that starts translating into frustrations from the patients, frustration from the ACPs. When you're not optimized, they're starting to feel like it's not easy for me to get this product. I don't want to do this. I'll throw in a little personal anecdote. My mom was just visiting me from St. Louis last week, and she's on a medication, and she went to her doctor and said, "This is not easy for me. I do not want to take it again." And no matter what he said to her, she wouldn't do it. And that's the kind of barrier that you need to avoid by making sure that you're optimized. Can't have that kind of conversation happen. And then the field staff, they're out there trying to push, but if they're not able to utilize data, they're going to get frustrated. They're not hitting their IC goals. And all of a sudden you have an adherence problem, turnover problems, and maybe wasting time misdiagnosing what your actual problem is that you need to solve because of the gaps in the data and not really understanding it.
Yeah, so it's almost like you're struggling to get to the root cause of what's going on, so you can't make the best decision then to help address it, and then therefore address some of maybe the secondary or tertiary symptoms that show up because of that. Is that
Yeah.
kind of how you take that,
I,
Tim?
I talked to a customer recently about a very complex problem that they had. And we were talking about the amount of data that we had to bring in, the different tools that we could use. And the initial response was, "Well, I don't really know if I like complex." And I said, "Well, let me explain. It's complex for us because we're setting up the data for you on your behalf. It's only complex for you because the way that you make decisions is going to change. Instead of making decisions at the national level, one big strategy decision, what we want you to do is more micro decisions. We want to bring forward those little decisions that can change your strategy and not feel like you're making one giant decision and then measuring it for 3 months to see if it worked. These are quick hit decisions. So while you have to make more of them, it's gonna help hone your strategy a lot easier than in that kind of way. So I'm always pushing towards using data to make those micro decisions. And I think our customers are really like it resonates with them. Feels like they have more control. So it's not necessarily complexity, it's control over smaller bits of their strategy that they never had before.
Yeah, and the kind of more I think about it, as we kind of think about how do you address all this and bring it all together, and referencing particularly one thing you said, Tim, which is there are some broader goals, but you've got to bring it down to a tactical level for folks to understand on the day to day. How do you help accomplish those? So as we kind of get into maybe some of the more specifics, we'll talk about very tactical metrics and how to look at those, but from our side, really comes down to first understanding what are you trying to achieve, right? Like what are the outcomes you want to be able to have, and that's what's going to help you set up your data and your metrics and KPIs and a ton of other stuff the right way to help enable those. And so, I think what we've seen some examples from clients we work with of how channel analytics can really help. It's everything from supporting the patient-centric programs to optimize patient outcomes to access and adherence. You talked a little bit about provider experience and adoption. But we think there's even more around, say, how do you work with your field sales organizations or reimbursement managers to kind of help identify any blockers or gaps in access, or understanding copay structures and availability, or market access work through understanding coverage implications. So it really can be used in almost all parts of the commercialization strategy when you talk channel analytics.
Yeah.
As we kind of think about it, it all really comes down to what is most important for the brand that you need to measure, and you can really set those goals accordingly. And so, maybe we can make this a little bit more real. And Tim, question for you then is, can you share an example of a client who was able to leverage some of this approach to really improve the brand and the program to deliver more outcomes? Like, what were some of the key takeaways, and how did that what were the
Yeah.
outcomes that they were trying to solve for?
We're working with a large customer, it has 5 different brands, and historically their brands were working in silos. And so one of the things we've done over the last couple of years is really all the things we were kind of talking about, creating a strategy for them so that there was a language across all brands. Even though there was nuances, we all understood what overall portfolio success looked like. We had key metrics at the portfolio level and key metrics at the individual brand level. And what we did was we had their hub provider across all their brands integrated with the CRM. The CRM was creating that data, and at that processing layer, there was some really interesting AI to capture sentiments about our interactions with patients, sentiments about how we were interacting with our HCPs. So it really gave us a holistic view of the actions that we could take. And all of that was really an integrated provider and patient journey map that you could visually see where were the problems happening in those levers that I mentioned earlier that you can actually control. You can't control everything, so you don't want to measure everything. So the key part here is you take all that data integrated from CRM, the activities, and all of the hub data, decide what are the action levers you can actually control, be able to map that out, and now you can see when is a doctor struggling, when is a patient falling off of the process, and then take immediate types of actions for that. And so this customer really saw the difference with that sort of integrated model, bringing data together and telling a holistic story so that they could see the success of everything they're doing, and not just at an individual level and then expecting using their sort of mind to come up with a story about the portfolio itself.
Interesting. Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense, right? So there's a lot of value that can come out of this. And so maybe if we kind of keep going in through thinking through kind of strategy, great. If we've kind of figured out what outcomes we want to be able to deliver at a broad level, you want to start getting a little bit more specific, but there are some core pieces that you've got to be able to pull together in terms of the data sources, like the hub you just mentioned in your example, Tim. How do you kind of think about understanding this mix of uh, KPIs and the level of detail you want to get to, and then a little bit about how you mentioned being able to start bringing that to the right level for the team that's working on it?
Yeah. I think the key is when you're talking about how to think about engagement, you're talking about individual people out there and trying to meet them where they live. So it's that personalization of the process. And I mentioned this before about instead of having that national view of your strategy and your KPIs, it's at that HCP, that patient level, learning more about them, using data to really understand that profile and understand the difference of those profiles is really it's going to help you. And to do that, you have to use that integrated data sources. You have to be able to bring, have a mechanism to bring patient and data and HCP data. You have to have an understanding of the levers of their behavior and the trending of that. And then understanding that these people live in a region, and the region then combining those different HCPs and those personas, using that at a regional level so that you can make good decisions at that region. So each region can be different depending on what's going on. If you have a major university that's hard to access, it's going to change the way that you're going to look at the territory there. It's going to change the way that you look at your key performance metrics there, because it's going to be different. And that leads to why you need to optimize your channel model, because it's not going to work the same way in every single region. We were looking at this, and we compared like Philadelphia and New York, two cities that are on the East Coast, very similar. Going face to face and talking to patients and doctors works in New York. Almost 80% of the ROI in a region can be gained that way. Philadelphia, much different. It's a very tech city. It's a city where if you're going face to face only in a channel that and trying to engage people that way, you're only going to get about 50% of your ROI. You have to put in other technologies. You have to let the region tell you how to engage there. And I think that's really the way the industry is kind of going, and so that we have that flexibility to go region by region on strategy.
Yeah, Tim, and I think we see the same thing at our side at Phil, right? It's not just the providers and how they want to be outreach, but it's the patient population that can be different. The plans that are top of mind will have different market access strategies. Providers are used to them, and so a lot of these things are actually interconnected. And so being able to be able to parse that apart is really important. And kind of my biggest takeaway from what you've said is you almost need a data model that's set up for you to be able to like look at the highest level and then double click and then double click again to get
Yeah,
really, really granular to get to, a provider level, patient level analytics over time, where that you can focus at the right level for where you are. But that has to be from the start. You have to build your structure and infrastructure that way to be set up.
absolutely. As much as I think that the culture and and is really super important, all this, I know as we get into the metrics piece of this, that's the fun stuff. That is the data modeling, that is the AI, that's the machine learning, that's the second half of that MMN survey about how do I actually use AI in any of these things to make it useful. That's the stuff that I love talking about. I know kind of skipping ahead to the next slide probably, but maybe I'll call it a transition into the metrics section of this discussion.
Yeah, now I think you'll probably hear me and Tim nerd out a little bit too much for the rest of this time, but this is where, as you mentioned, I think where we get most excited. And so, Tim, you've talked a little bit about, we want to know what we're solving for, maybe globally for a brand or for an organization, but then making it real for the folks on the ground.
Yeah.
I think the way one of the ways to think about this is like by the end stakeholder that you're really working for, because each of them will have different things that you're working to optimize or outcomes you want to achieve that need to still ladder up to say an overall KPI. Uh, but that KPI, let's say it's something like gross to net or something else. When you talk about the patient experience or the provider experience or your copay design and program structure, each of these is not going to say like a gross to net as a calculation or a metric because that doesn't mean anything for what's happening on the ground. And so maybe we can spend a little bit of time here talking through, by stakeholder, what are some of those different metrics that matter most when you're thinking about the patient versus the provider or maybe
Yeah.
just the program design?
No, I think you're absolutely right. These are broad sentiments of things that you would want to measure. But I think for the audience, they need to really look at that and say, look, what does time to fill really mean for me? Sometimes it could be as easy as our hub is basically taking care of most of it, and it's super easy. And once, within an hour of getting a prescription, I can go into a pharmacy and get my drug and move on with my life. But I have other customers I work with that we had to set up notifications because there was a process to fill that drug. It was a rare disease. And the team needed to be notified that a script just got filled and requested. They needed to plan travel because they had to be on site to administer this drug. So they had to travel. That is a completely different sort of metric than just watching a script go to Walgreens and going and walking in and grabbing it. So each product is going to be much different, and you really have to understand how you would measure it. Time to fill for the first example is super easy. Your hub's going to do it mostly for you. But the other piece of it, there's other metrics you might need to use, like the time it takes for you to be able to get an airline ticket. Like you're going to all of a sudden create this data set that you need that's not something your competitors have to do, but you have to think about that because you only have a certain amount of time in this particular case to actually reach that patient. It's very nuanced, and so you can get really in depth. And the same thing for providers. Really, we've seen those reach number or the access numbers go down again to like the pre-COVID levels. We kind of had a golden age there for a while where doctors really had a lot more time. And so it's just getting harder and harder again to reach them. But how you even how you measure reach or frequency, the really sort of traditional measurements, I probably have 10 for different customers and they all calculate it somewhat differently because of the nuance of their strategy. So it really is important to really understand what is going to drive your performance and not just sort of stick with a generic type of like reach or frequency or time to fill type of metric.
Yeah, so my kind of takeaway there is like, while what's on the screen here, like rate starting metrics, they really have to start getting customized by like the brand and what you're working on. And the other thing I think you mentioned, which is it's got to be linked to the broader strategy of what you're trying to achieve. And going back maybe to the time to fill example you called, not only how you measure it and what you need to measure may change, but if you have a broader strategy, even this a drug in the same therapeutic area may have two different ways that you want to measure it. An example could be something like, well, one drug has substantial sampling. So what good looks like for this metric means you may be able to wait a little bit of time, and that's okay to get the patient on therapy because they're going to have a sample for 1 week or 1 month on hand.
Yeah.
Whereas, let's say you don't have samples available in the field, easily accessible, then maybe you need this time to be as short as possible to create a great patient experience.
Yeah. And connecting it to the HCP provider patient journey, one of the things that we've really started to latch on to, we have a market research service called Answer Suite, and we can go ask questions in the field with doctors who will tell us about things. So we incorporate sort of that qualitative the view into this as well. So my time to fill might look like this and say, oh, I think this is really great. But then again, we ask the doctor how easy it is to actually do this process in the office, and they give us a low score, then we still know there's a problem. So even just looking at understanding that like every single data point has a behavior that it's attached to in the real world, really thinking through what is that behavior? Can I measure that too, along with the quantitative data set that I'm looking at? I think that's what makes it really interesting, and it uncovers potential issues or just tells you that you're doing the right thing. But I think if you don't think about it that way and really dig into, like we just went through multiple examples of time to fill and all kinds of ways to look at it, every single one of these is the same way. If you don't kind of dig in and think about that, then you might be missing something.
Yeah, and I think the other part you talked a little bit about is like these are so interconnected, right? It's impossible to fully parse apart one metric than the other because they do influence each other, and that's why being able to say these are laddered metrics that are important to individual stakeholders or your patient access or patient support team versus your market access team is important, but you have to be able to ladder that back up to the outcomes you're trying to deliver. And you talked a little bit about how, some of the provider influence, but, you think about your copay card design or your ability to get a patient started at a $0 price is going to impact your patient's willingness to start therapy or, wanting their ability to stay adherent over time as well if they can afford your medication. So,
Yeah.
these interconnected parts are so important to think through as well, that even though an individual, say on the ground, a field salesperson may only really think about a couple of these, you do have to have this broader set of how do you pull all this together to understand that journey mapping I think you were talking about earlier, Tim, about where the gaps are, because you don't want to look in isolation for that reason.
Yeah. The reason why I'm so big on the journey is because it's changed. When I was in a previous company, I worked in market research, and we were working on sort of linguistic research in the point of care. And one of the trends that was coming out of COVID was that patients were coming into the doctor much more informed, much more opinionated. They're not coming in just to get advice and get told what to do anymore. And so that's why knowing that behavior, being able to measure that, how easy you can be, and how being able to live where they live at, being able to give them access to the information so that they don't get a negative connotation, but you can only know to measure that kind of thing and that behavior trend that's going on. If you look at those qualitative metrics along with the quantitative metrics, it makes it so it's more difficult, but you have to force yourself to get a more holistic view of it, or else you're going to go back to the risks and of wasting time, wasting capacity, and wasting money, which no one wants to do.
Yeah, and so I think we've hit the importance on some of this top-down metrics and keeping them connected. One of the other things we did talk about is also then how do you start getting even more specific, right? So even at this case, we look at time to fill. This may be a national metric if we measure it as a single number. You've talked a little bit about already then, okay, well, what's the next level you need to double click into? And how do you start thinking regionally or territory specific or provider specific? So maybe we can dive a little bit into that and spend some time, as we double click. Now you've kind of gotten the metrics, you've got them well defined, you're able to look at them and understand their implications on each other and what good looks like. How do you then start thinking about breaking this down to the territory level or regional level for the metrics you've identified so that you're able to understand what you can do differently?
Yeah. This is probably the topic I spend the most time talking with customers about. How do you improve engagement? How do we understand how to do that? And the two things that come to mind all the time are really, we have two things. One's called channel affinity, one's called mindset engine. And to me, it is the core of everything that you do in pharma. On one side, it's channel affinity, knowing the doctor's historic engagement with certain channels across the spectrum, face-to-face, virtual, email, Viva Engage, whatever channels that you've used before, and being able to tie it back to multiple different data points. Not just that, hey, I've knocked on your door 10 times and you answered 8 times. It's I've knocked on your door, and after each time I've done that, I've seen an increase in script writing, I've seen an increase in behavior. And so now you can model it out and say, not only that I saw you 8 times in a certain period of time, I also sent you an email and I saw you either did engage with that or you didn't engage with that. You were part of our digital campaign, and how did you react to that? So it's really holistically looking at all the different channels, and for every HCP, they get a score that says this is how you interact with them. And if you do that, you're going to get this amount of performance. I worked with a large pharma company recently, and we did an experiment on this, and we showed them that what they were doing with 125 people, they could have been doing with 100 people if we were actually engaging these doctors with the actual mix of channels that they were actually going to engage with, and then do something that you wanted them to do afterwards. So this is where machine learning, this is where AI comes into play. It'd be very difficult to have somebody do this on an Excel spreadsheet and make decisions on, but we've seen a lot of this has been something that's very popular. On the flip side is the mindset engine. This is a proprietary data set on the qual side of things, asking doctors across the country and other countries how they make decisions. And so how do you actually, when you see things, how are you engaging with that message? How do you turn that into a treatment decision? And so really what it comes down to is that if you understand how to engage somebody correctly, the way they want to be engaged, and then you understand the right message when you get there, then you're really truly hitting them in where they live at and really maximizing the impact to get more of their time, to get more of their focus. They're listening to you so that, and this is a patient or provider, so that they're really retaining the message. So the next time you actually engage with them, they're going to retain more of that, and you're going to have to spend less time retraining on the messaging you've already been giving. So it's really, really interesting way of using AI and data together on both that sort of tactical, medical, and also the behavioral science fields together and to make decisions.
Yeah, and I think that's kind of going back to the focus of where we saw most of the attendees for the webinar. This is really maybe that missing piece of how do you start turning this into really significant, actionable insights, right? So you've got the data, if we pick time to fill, let's say it's 5 days. What do you do with that information? That's really hard to action on if you just know that metric. But as we're talking about, how do you use that data then to translate to where are very specific gaps at a more tailored level so that you can turn that into what does a field sales rep need to go in and have a conversation about what digital
Yeah.
marketing or outreach needs to be stated, like what campaign will work really well for education, or what do maybe a reimbursement manager need to reach out about if there's challenges with coverage or other aspects. So you could really start tailoring it if you're looking at these metrics, double click to the right level. And, I think maybe to give an example from the Phil side, This is an example of what's on the screen about how Phil looks at some of these metrics at a territory level. And we do a provider level as well, which we can talk about in a second. But the territory level is really important for us, and how we see our clients really utilizing this is it really enables the, say, sales managers or sales leaders to understand where they could be training differently, provide coaching and support where a territory may have a specific struggle, or maybe this is what helps them understand some of those regional trends that you had called out, that, hey, we're struggling with XYZ in this territory because of a very specific plan that is really difficult to get coverage for, because it turns out patients may not enroll in the program because it's a very English as a second language territory, or space. And so those are the type of things where then you can say, well, if that's the problem, we can come up with a very specific tactic that's applicable. But unless you got to that level, you're never going to know that's what you had to create, because it's going to be very like blended in across the all of it, right? So if you looked at patient engagement rate overall, it may look great, but if you want to go from 90 to 92%, that's not going to be moving everybody up 2 percentage points. That's really going to be this bottoms up territory or provider level rehabilitation of the metrics to say, where is it not working because we can measure it? Then let's go have that in-person conversation, or qualitative metrics on top of that you can start adding to understand what isn't working. And I think that's maybe a part we haven't talked about, Tim, that we can. How do
Sure.
you think about pulling together some of the qualitative feedback or information that we can capture? Because I think, you and I both mentioned a little bit, like capturing everything is probably impossible to the nuance through just data alone. So how do you take some of these qualitative insights or things you can learn from conversations to help maybe even bolster this further?
Yeah, I think one of the things that's super important I mentioned around just finding out whether or not the feeling of being easy is something that you can capture, which you can. But one of the other things that I know that my team actually works on is what we call an AI curated platform, and it's really built for MSLs, FRM teams, nurse educator teams, people who are working with people in the office or in the field or the providers or the patients, and creating notes, creating interaction notes around what happened with when they're talking to somebody. And the more detailed notes, the more you can use artificial intelligence to really capture what's the sentiment, what are the key words that are happening. And as you were kind of mentioning it, on multiple levels, maybe there's a specific office that's struggling with something and you can tailor a training just to them. Maybe it is an entire region that you're seeing this problem, the same sort of either negative sentiment or a misunderstanding of the messaging, and you can then take action on those things. Or maybe it's at the national level and that you're seeing a trend and it's across everywhere and not just regionalized or at an office. It's super important. And I think a lot of times what's happening is all these notes are going into your CRM, or if you're not using a CRM, going into an Excel sheet somewhere, and no one was doing anything with it. Now it's a source of qualitative data you probably have sitting in somewhere within your business right now that you can be utilizing it. And it becomes a really interesting way of understanding not just what you need to take action on, but then the next quarter, as you're generating these same interactions, what's changed? Has the knowledge transfer changed? Is the messaging connecting? Did you make an adjustment, that micro decision, and has it worked? Or did you just train that one office who seemed to be not getting it in the way that you were training it? You changed your training to be more relevant to them, and then you saw the impact from it. It's not something that you can get from directly from a data, because the data could look positive as you mentioned, but really what's going on behind the scenes and that qualitative standpoint is super important. So using tools like that, using tools like Answer Suite or other kind of service that's giving you that syndicated trending of how good you're doing, I think is super important.
Yeah, and maybe then to kind of dive on this, and this is hopefully what's the most helpful, is you kind of have to make sure you have this level of information available at this granularity to get to the outcomes. Maybe then another way we can kind of talk about this is even more examples of ways you can make sure you're utilizing this level of information through the organization, right? So I think we gave a little bit of example of how provider education and outreach can be completed. I think we talked a little bit about, say, how field sales organizations may be able to leverage data at this level to improve training or re-education opportunities. Are there other aspects of how you think about patients or other users in kind of the commercialization arm of pharma that would be able to leverage this
Oh,
level of knowledge?
absolutely. If I think back to the example I gave earlier about a situation where I thought it was really good, that is one of the things that the patient engagement through the inbound and outbound services that this customer is using. And all of that is in phone calls that are being recorded, transcribed. And so you have the opportunity to use natural language processing in the moment to really drive a next best action on a phone call. I mean, that's how fast it can be. So if a patient says something and it picks up as either something that's nuanced in that patient, or maybe it's a trend that the AI has been picking up on, it can pop up a note and say, "Hey, ask them about this," or "Hey, make this comment." You can do this in the moment, and that's literally qualitative as they're speaking data that you can use in order to better engage them in the moment, or utilizing transcripts afterwards to really be able to run that through some kind of an AI or machine learning process to understand what patients are seeing, what they're the same as like an MSL, being able to understand what they're thinking at that sort of regional and national level. And I think also using those next best action data points that cause that sort of interaction with a patient, being able to ask them in the moment. A lot of times when they're enrolling within their hub, you can send them things, get to see how they think things are going, get that real time feedback from them. And a lot of times when they're really happy, they're more than happy to give you their response. Or if they're not really happy, they're more than happy to. But that's the things you want to hear about: what is working, what's not working. So all these avenues are ways that you can generate this qualitative data that we're not necessarily used to using. And it's where in that MM&AM survey around, I don't know how to use AI, this is the perfect stuff. This is the things that you can't really afford to have somebody sitting around reading every one of these to try to pull out themes. This is what AI really can do to accelerate the metrics you're using and how you're measuring your performance.
Yeah, and one thing that kind of stuck out to me from what you said, Tim, is it's the outliers that tend to be the most vocal, right? And I think this is really important for brands as well, because let's say you're not getting this tactical level feedback, or even going one level deeper into physician level or patient level insights. If you only hear the folks who are willing to take the extra effort to have a conversation, 90% of the time, it's going to be the folks who had an outlier experience.
Yeah.
Something didn't work exactly as you had liked. And so I think really two things from that. One is, who picks up the phone, and let's say it's a patient who, if the patient had a great experience, they started therapy right away and it happened to be $0 for them covered by insurance. Well, that patient's not going to call their doctor and say, "Man, what a great experience I had. I'm so glad we did this." But the patient who maybe took a little longer, had some challenges with their plan coverage, are going to call in and be like, "I still haven't got my medication. What's going on?" And what the doctor's heard is one patient. And the only person who they've heard, they see 100% of patient complaints. And so I think the other way that this data is really useful is what you mentioned, is putting it in perspective. That, hey, 95% of the time it's working really, really well. Yes, this is one of the 5%, and can provide, field sales organizations, or internal teams a better understanding of how to put things in context of, is this something I need to think about holistically, or is this an isolated incident that
Yeah.
I need to address?
And I think that's where the patient and provider profiles come into play. You can then use some machine learning modeling to be able to look for lookalikes. Maybe there are people out there having that same experience, that the other data points that describe who this person is, there are another 5% out there that just may not be as vocal as the other 5%. but you can make some assumptions and say, look, I might have this problem and it might be 10% of the problem because all these people also look the same as these people. And I see the same behaviors, the same activities, the same type of person. And that's another interesting way that I know we're using AI and machine learning models to really be able to really look under every single rock and everything we can know about what's going on. And these models are very useful to use. Like, you don't need a model for every single thing. A lot of times these will do multiple types of work for you, and you can uncover all these types of these potential problems and things that you can address right away.
Yeah, and so, maybe to kind of summarize some of this is it's really important for folks to be able to double click into so many of these layers and think about this at a regional, territory, provider, and even patient level. And so if you think about the data structure and how do you pull data-driven decisions, you'd ideally want to be able to set this up so that you can pull them at any level and make the decision accordingly. Well, you understand what's a trend at each individual level, and then you can get more and more specific as you go down. So that's, what I took away from our conversation for some of this, Tim, is, you should hopefully have reporting that looks like something on the page where you can really understand some of these KPIs at very tactical levels.
Yeah, I think it's, if I said to the audience, like, take away one thing, it's it's that systems, process, culture. Make sure you're looking at all those pieces. Make sure you have that common language. If you do that, it's going to be much easier to diagnose the data that you need, the metrics that are going to be those levers, and the technology to help you drive that in an efficient way, so that you can make sure that your providers and patients are having a good experience with your brand and that you're driving to the maximum performance you can.
Yeah, and so maybe then we'll share a little bit of a case study then of pulling this all together. Maybe a brand that's done this really well and help quantify, what some of this looks like. This is an example from Phil. One of our clients who's very data savvy, has a lot of this understanding and setup, launched nationally with a change in copay structure, with the launch of a hub through Phil, where a lot of this wasn't available before. But they've really kind of were facing fierce competition in the space and seeing high abandonment, non-adherence. And so they understood a lot of these metrics and were able to utilize a lot of what we've talked about here by being able to double click so many different ways to really help improve patient awareness, adherence, boost HCP engagement, which is both adoption of prescriptions as well as their engagement in the coverage process for the medication. And overall, all that leads to is, one of their primary outcomes was hoping to increase the gross to net and at the end of the day. And so they were an example of a client who's launched a lot of this strategy, understood the nuances without losing its sense of the bigger picture that they were achieving, and were able to implement this in a way where they were able to substantially increase their prior auth submission rate from before and after by making some program design changes that really made sure folks are doing the work to get as we get access to, say, easier cash price or uncovered offering were available in kind of this space. And then while at the same time providing that flexibility to make sure patients can start care, but they were able to double their coverage dispenses, which at the end of the day was a key determination of that. When you get more covered dispenses and you triple your adherence for it, you're going to see massive increases in your total gross to net dollars, as an example. And so they're able to keep a lot of these focus in mind and still work at the tactical level to rehabilitate where, well, they saw a specific territory that didn't have, PA submission because the doctors were having some challenge, and you were able to go down bottoms up and rehabilitate it. So these metrics continue to improve even beyond, say, a transition period. And this creates almost this opportunity for endless loop of optimization. Awesome. I think then we're getting to the Q&A session. So, Mira, I'll kind of turn it over to you.
Yeah, absolutely. So would love to now open the floor to questions. If anyone has questions they'd like to ask Sahil and Tim, now's the time. And while we wait, would love to just run a super quick poll right now, just to ask if anyone would like a follow-up conversation from our team. No pressure at all, but I will put that up in case you do. Also wanted to share the playbook on the right. That goes kind of a level deeper and provides really nice tactical examples of what we've been talking about today. So definitely check that out if you're interested in kind of understanding and tying a bow nicely on, how you can put this into practice. All right, so we're going to go ahead and close that poll, and then would love to see and just give everyone another minute or so if you do have questions. All right, one question we have here is, you had mentioned an improvement in PA submission rate in the case study. What did that look like in comparison to the rest of the market, i.e. their direct competitors?
Yeah. So in the case study, I think a lot of this is, I would think about it as two parts. So, the strategies included a change in copay structure at retail that incentivized higher prior auth submission for the brand, as well as through adding an uncovered option that was available through a PA denial through a hub. So both of those is how we achieve the higher aspects of prior auth submission. But if we look at before the submission of even this brand before this change, that was, I think they roughly doubled the number of PAs that went through just pre and post change. And so if you think about that compared to the market in dermatology specifically, this can be a very hard challenge to overcome with providers in terms of getting prior auth submissions. And we've seen, the market and competition look closer to anywhere between 45 to 60% prior auth submission on average, which is kind of where this particular client was before as well.
Amazing. Give everyone just another minute here, and then we can go ahead and give people a few minutes back if that's what it'll be. All right, another question here is, how have you seen patient level data leveraged in a retail type product?
So I think that from a retail type project, we have it's an interesting thing because we're working on a large customer right now that has a lot of brands that you'd obviously recognize. And it can be a struggle sometimes because a lot of times it's around like the sales data is not necessarily connected. There's a lot of like the referral type of like how often did you actually refer this product instead of a direct script type of thing. And so one of the ways that we try to use the data is actually more in the qualitative state. There's less of the direct outside of just sort of regional sales data, which is not connected to a specific type of patient. It's really that qualitative data, and how we try to use that data is really from a understanding of, did they use that in any kind of way, and then did they actually go back and purchase it again? We've gotten that from like answer suite kind of data. We've also used other data sets that can connect a visit to a pharmacy from what they actually had a script, but also what they purchased in other places within that pharmacy. And so you have to get creative about these things because it's not a direct one-for-one type of what a one-for-one kind of look. That the data set about their activities when they're in the pharmacy is super interesting because you get a look at this is not like necessarily an over-the-counter drug. So do they actually only buy it whenever they're in there with the pharmacy? Do they buy it when they're not just going and filling a different kind of script? It's super, super interesting. So it's definitely harder. That's kind of the theme here that Sahil and I were talking about. Some of these data sets you got to get creative with it. You have to really understand where can you go out and get data that's like this. There's a lot of different data sources like that. Hopefully that answers your question, but it's one of those sort of creative ways to look at data and how we utilize some of that market research data that gets collected out there, that's syndicated data. And it goes back to that profiling when you can connect that activities at the retail level with the activities at the script level, you can really get an understanding of a person's overall behavior and how they might be reacting.
Yeah, and Tim, I think the other thing to add too is the goal is always to kind of create that full journey map for the patient,
Yeah.
right? And at retail it can be a little bit more challenging because you don't see many of the pieces of the process. But with claim data and others, you can start piecing together enough to understand at least what part of the process things may be challenging.
Yeah.
Right. We've seen some clients who've used claim data to understand reversal rate. So you can understand what coverage looked like at that time to what copays those were at. So you can understand if the copays causing challenges, whether coverage was creating high prices. And that's, it doesn't tell you the full story, but at least it's one extra level. And one
Yeah.
of the things we've seen be successful, even for retail products, is using like a hub like Phil as an example, not meant to be a self plug, but where you have only a portion of your scripts that maybe run through this channel, but you have end-to-end visibility. And so, let's say it's only 10-20% of your prescriptions that go through a limited channel, but if that channel can give you some of this end-to-end patient journey data, that's applicable to almost 100% of your patient population at retail. And so, if you understand that, hey, patients are not converting at a $45 price or a $120 price, you're going to understand that's going to happen everywhere. Or
Yeah.
if they're not engaging in certain parts of the process, or that prior auths are not going through, well, then you can assume that there's a lot about what it will look like in retail when you have some full end-to-end data as well.
Yeah, and there's a lot of data sets that are becoming available that you can really piece together. The problem of going back to almost the very beginning is if you don't have a way to actually connect that so you can tell a full story, to tell that journey mapping, it can be incredibly difficult to look at. So there are assumptions you have to make, and that's again another great place that you can use some of this sort of AI modeling, because it can piece together those profiles, it can piece together those data points for you, and you can tell a story that probably 10 years ago was incredibly difficult to tell.
That's amazing. All right, we are nearly at time, so we're going to sign off. Thank you so much, everyone, for being here today and tuning in. Tim Sawhill, thank you for sharing your insights. Really appreciate it. And if anyone has any follow-up questions, feel free to reach out anytime. We are here for you, and we hope to see you again soon.